Hi, everyone. I'm Manuel Copas. I have the pleasure today to have a conversation. I'm going to say a fireside chat with Professor Yves Moreau, who is professor at University of Leuven.
Yeah.
And well, I think the sort of history between me and Professor comes from the fact that one of your PhD students was working in Cambridge at the Sanger Institute, as I was then joined at the DECIPHER database, for which I was a senior developer. And I think that, when I see my publications, because as it happens, we share that main publication for DECIPHER, and it has like 2,000 citations. So we have that amazing work in common. So Professor Ives, I have been quite sort of inspired by the messages, by the story that you have to say today with regards the future of technology in general. And we're going to touch into that in a minute. But first of all, can you tell people a little bit about what you do and sort of what your research is on, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of engineering in Leuven in Belgium. My background is really as an engineer with a focus on AI, back to even my undergrad days, I worked on neural networks. And then around 2000, I started specializing in bioinformatics, so analysis of genetics data, also later drug discovery data, combining my AI or data analysis background and developing genetics expertise. And that's the core of my day job, I would say. Next to that, for 10, 15 years, I've been quite preoccupied about the impact that technology is having on our society. And from there, I started to look into how I could contribute to what I call social debates on these issues. Sometimes really like at the debate level. I'm part of a network in Belgium called Carta Academica of academics who want to engage with society in socially important debates where academic knowledge or viewpoints can contribute. We have a weekly column in a main Belgian newspaper. And next to that, also, eventually I entered very concrete action. I became quite concerned with the issue of misuse of genetics, in particular forensic genetics, so the kind of CSI genetics that you use to solve crimes, but it can be turned into a tool of mass surveillance. And I worked for the last 7, 8 years on this issue, in particular with regard to China and the persecution of Uyghurs and Tibetans. But that issue is certainly not limited strictly to China, although there the scale is much bigger than anywhere else. But we've seen this used elsewhere, trying to determine the ethnic origin of people applying for asylum in Britain or Canada, trying to sort out and surveillance people at the border between US and Mexico. But of course, the problems in China were much, much bigger. So I worked a lot on this for several years, and I'm still working on this. In particular, I've obtained a retraction of 38 journal articles in that field, which is really quite substantial because some of that research is ethically problematic. It involved researchers from the police studying the population that they are persecuting. I mean, some of that was really quite shocking. But more generally, and to address your introduction, how is technology, and in my field, of course, AI, reshaping society, and where do we want to go from here? And then I maybe want to go back to 10, 15 years ago, where I really started asking myself, okay, what do I want to do with the next 25 years of my career? And I became a full professor. I mean, you can keep moving your career forward. That's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You can become an expert of an expert in your field. But I felt for myself that this was not just what I wanted to do. I think of myself as a scientist, but also as an intellectual, whatever exact meaning you put behind that. But I think people with academic expertise, with scientific expertise, need to help society think about itself and about its future. So I wanted to find ways to engage with society. Looking at abuses of genetic data was one way, but more generally, I think that the transformation we're seeing now is really going so fast. And 15 years ago, I was in my lab and I was hearing people already say, society is changing so fast, everything is going so fast. And I was thinking to myself, well, you think this is going fast, and I felt you always use the same metaphor of a kid on the beach who can barely swim and just makes it, and the parents are looking anxiously about the waves that's 50 centimeters high, and will the kid be okay? And you see the tsunami, you know, a kilometer away from the beach, but moving so quickly. This is really how I felt back then. And I felt that as a scientist, as an academic, I had the duty to, help society in my limited ways, because we don't solve problems. We just help, we push in a certain direction, help society go through these changes. To be honest, I didn't see the wave of large language models coming. I was really as surprised as most of my colleagues, also AI colleagues. I think if you were not working at OpenAI, Google, or Meta, you probably didn't see that one coming. But more generally, more globally, the idea that technology, information technology, AI, were going to transform society more and more, that I certainly grasped 15 years ago. And that's why I felt that I had a commitment. I had to engage with society. And so if you look at my profile, you'll see that I'm a concerned scientist. I think it's a good word to say, well, as a scientist, yes, we develop new things, we develop cool tools, but okay, maybe we should be a little bit concerned about the impact of those tools on people around us.
Wow. So this sense of urgency that I also feel, by the way, why should we be concerned about the current technological advancement?
Yeah, I think, if you take it in a very, very long-term perspective, a couple of centuries, maybe it's all going to be fine in the end. The thing that I'm seeing is, of course, disruption is not a new thing. We've seen disruptions. Very interesting, for example, to go back 100 years, 1920s or so, and look at the literature, at the authors. You could read Bertrand Russell, G.B.S. Haldane, and, remember that's the time of Brave New World. So the idea of disruption, of technology radically changing our world, is not an entirely new idea. And eventually, well, yes, society kind of recovers. At the same time, yeah, well, after that, we also had World War II. So technology there also had a very big impact. But eventually, I guess that society absorbs these disruptions. Okay. Now, here, what we're facing is we're just barely gone through the internet disruption. And now we're going to face the AI, LLM disruption. And I can see that, well, certainly in the next few years, is it 2, is it 5, is it 10, is it 20? I don't know. It's very hard to tell. But this wave that we're going through, I'm really quite convinced that there's going to be another wave very soon after, probably not 20 years, more like 5 or 10. And after that, there might be another wave. So when you say, well, there is disruption and then society recovers, we don't have a model for disruption followed by disruption, followed by disruption, followed by disruption. And the level of disruption that we can anticipate right now is already extremely concerning. Take self-driving cars. Yeah, self-driving cars are super cool. But take self-driving trucks. Well, they're super cool too, of course. Now, truck driving is 2% of jobs in the United States. The day that we can buy a truck with, a few tens or maybe $100,000 extra, it will self-drive across the country, we will fundamentally disrupt that part of the job market. We will cut the number of truck drivers probably by a factor 2 or 3 or 4, or maybe not. We are not always, it's very hard to predict the future, so I'm not making any claims. And I'm just saying, well, this is just one example. Um, all the artists I know around me, they say, well, what about, my creativity as a graphic artist, as a musician, as a narrator, storytelling, what's going to be the impact? Maybe this is all going to be super cool tools that humans use to create you in much better ways than they could before. That is possible. And, in the end, I love technology, and I want to believe that technology ultimately will contribute to the common good. But we will have to steer this. We'll have to make choices. And so I think we need to become intentional about technology. So my perspective is that in the past 400 years, you go back to Descartes or Francis Bacon, that's the beginning of the 1600s. They actually, not fully consciously, but they set up the program of modernity. They realized that science and technology could radically change the world around them for the better, that we would be less hungry, less cold, less sick. It's very obvious from their writing. And I think following that over the years, through Enlightenment and so on, we basically threw the kitchen sink at the problem. Every new scientific advance, every new innovation was, to be tried and see what happens. And this, has changed our world radically. It has increased our life expectancy by a factor 2 in the developed world. The rest of the world is, shifting very quickly in the same direction. This is fantastically good news. I mean, that progress has been immensely useful. The worst kind of poverty, has diminished very, very substantially over the past decades. Hundreds of millions of people in China are moving from, utter poverty to middle class status and above. That's fantastic. But I think that now we're kind of hitting the limits of that program. I think that at the end of the 20th century, we kind of entered the final phase of that program, and now we have to think about, okay, what is next? We have, planetary boundaries. We cannot keep, using more and more resources. That's not going to work. We have social stress that is very real. We're richer than when my parents were kids. Are we happier? I'm not sure at all. I mean, I would question that. Maybe not much. Maybe not much worse in terms of well-being, mental health. So what about the program where we would say, okay, let's think for a second what we want for the next couple of centuries. What do we want to reach? And I think there we may have different views. I mean, there are people who push, and there are, of course, billionaires are very rich. They push transhumanist ideas, this long-termism is just push as hard as you can to go as fast as you can. Yeah, but to go where? And except saying we're going to go to Mars because Earth is, will go down the hole, and we need to go to Mars and then conquer the universe and the galaxy. Well, that's not a program for me. That's not a program for 10 billion people, because that's around the number that we're going to be on this earth in the coming centuries. For 10 billion people, that's not a program for how to live in the future. So we have to radically, sit down and say, hey, what is it that you want for the future? What is it what you want for your kids, your grandkids, and your grandkids? I mean, after that, 10,000 years from now, I don't think we have that much of a moral responsibility. To contrast that with long-termism that says, well, we have to care about humanity 100,000 years from now. What does it mean? I have no idea what it can mean. But our kids, our grandkids, yeah, I care about that. And so what kind of world do we want to shape with them? Because they already, of course, my son is 25, so he already has a say in the matter. Many of my colleagues have grandkids, so they will soon have a say in the matter as well. But really, like, what do we want? I mean, what kind of life do we want? This is a very hard question, because it's a question that we haven't asked for a long while. I mean, maybe if you go back to the Greeks and the Romans, and they're the strong, the richest and most powerful people. They had the time to reflect about what is the good life. I think we're really now in a society where there's so much pressure to everyone that we don't really have the space to reflect that much about, okay, what kind of life do we want? But if you think in terms of the wealth that we can produce, or, the products, the food, there is, already today. I mean, if you take, for example, the average GDP per capita across the world, it's about the level of Costa Rica. And Costa Rica has a life expectancy that's above that of the United States. I mean, I'm not saying it's a perfect country. I've never traveled to Costa Rica, but to give an idea, if wealth was spread more uniformly, and I'm not saying anything communist, just avoiding this incredible accumulation, then we could already today probably give a decent life to pretty much everyone on the planet. So I think this is much more the kind of program that most people would start come up with if they had, a couple hours to sit around the table and say, okay, what is it that we want for ourselves? How do we want to live in the future with all the technology and resources that we have?
So what do you think about, would you agree that currently there is a concentration of power to an extent that we've never seen before, particularly around those that control artificial intelligence? And how can we avoid becoming slaves or the new serfs of a new technocratic aristocracy that now is more and more controlling, everything? I mean, we know that, like, something like maybe the 10 most richest people in the world have a GDP comparable to a whole country, like maybe the Netherlands or something like that. So what can we do to avoid that?
Yeah. So I agree completely that there is this incredible concentration, meaningless concentration of money and thus power. That this happens also, there is like this economic power and then there's the political power, and you also see like the fusion of the two. I mean, the United States is the perfect example where Trump is president and Musk has tried to run basically the whole administration. I mean, being more than what a prime minister typically is able to do in any country. So this concentration of money and thus power, it's incredible. Is it without precedent? I think we're kind of on the borderline here. If you go back to US history, there is the era of the golden barons at the Industrial Revolution, the Rockefellers and Vanderbilt and so on. They were also incredibly rich compared to the wealth available in their societies, but we're at least at that level. We are at least back into the era of the the robber barons. And so, yeah, after that, good things happened after that. So this is not the end of history. So we are not condemned to centuries and millennia of control by those most powerful people. There are reactions. So I don't want to be optimistic because I'm not, but I don't want to be too pessimistic either. I mean, even if you take the United States, it's not dead yet. It's in the worst place that I could have imagined. I think when Trump was elected, I was really fundamentally depressed because I saw what is now happening coming. But at the same time, there is a reaction of many people in the United States. There is resistance. So that battle, they haven't won yet. Okay, but they might well win that battle. So we have to worry about, okay, how far will that go, and will there be enough resistance to block them, or will eventually that society collapse to an autocratic model? That's very well possible. We've seen, how, for example, Hungary in Europe, as the Orban regime has been able to break down the resistance in society. We've seen resistance, for example, in Poland, and even though it's still a very conservative regime, it's a lively society. So So it's hard to know where this will land, but we certainly have to be concerned about, okay, this accumulation of power, the most powerful arranging themselves into systems of control more and more. But I want to insist also on the meaninglessness. The meaninglessness is, what on earth do these people do with these billions of dollars? I mean, take Musk. He sleeps in his office under his desk when things go wrong with this company. What's tens of billions of dollars were good for if you have to regularly sleep in your office at your job. So it's kind of this video game gone crazy. You can take this idea, yeah, is this not for these people just a video game? They want to achieve the top score. The money is just a number, and then they look at the Forbes ranking and they see where they are, and that's the game they're playing. The problem with this game is that it's not just a video game that happens with bits on a computer. That's a video game where at the end of the process, there is actually a family struggling to have ends meet at the end of the month. There is a mother who has to take a second or third job in the United States. So it has very real consequences, real world consequences on others. But just this perspective of saying, well, what you are doing is kind of meaningless. You're pushing ideas. You could say, well, Musk at least now is able to push his ideology forward. But what ideology? He was somewhere else on the political spectrums even 5 years ago. Maybe he'll be somewhere else in another 5 years. And why do some people need to have so much power on others except to do this kind of public psychotherapy? I mean, one thing that Trump and Musk have in common is that they have had serious problems with their fathers, or they still have, for in the case of Musk. And I think these people are acting out their personal trauma on a scale that affects every one of us. That's completely crazy. Now, can we do something about it? Well, I don't know. I think that, let's say, before the re-election of Trump, I was feeling like, okay, we are in this car with a drunk teenager driving. We're driving way too fast. We're approaching this strong turn. We should slow down, and then maybe we'll be kind of okay. At this point, I feel like we're gonna get out of the road. Maybe we can just have the car flip over with our seat belts, and maybe we'll be okay in the end. Or maybe there is a cliff behind that, and we're going for the cliff. Where we are in these scenarios, I'm not exactly sure. I don't think anybody really can know, but we have to take that into account. So for me, at this point, I've shifted from an attitude where we say, yeah, we have to push as hard as we can to avoid a catastrophe, to we have to push as hard as we can to avoid a catastrophe and be prepared for what happens if we have to go through a catastrophe. I'm not saying one will happen or the other. I think a main driver in there is climate change. If you ask me to put a bet before Trump was elected on what was the maximum temperature we would reach, I'm not a specialist, but I would have bet at plus 2.7 degrees, which is kind of dramatic. If you ask me today, I'm probably betting on 3.2, which is catastrophic. Could be worse, but I think the technology is advancing rapidly. Solar and wind is becoming cheaper. We can anticipate important progress on nuclear energy in the coming decades, or even less. So there is a possibility that in terms of climate change, we could be in a much better place 20, 30 years from now. And, will it be great? It's not going to be great, but it might not be completely terrible, that the civilization cannot survive. So a scale at which we have to reflect is, are we going through a shock that will basically destroy our civilization, and what will come after that will be another civilization with other social norms? Or are we going to go through a shock from which civilization will recover, and then we'll be doing something maybe somewhat different, but that will still be pretty much in the same type of framework? And I think a good example is the Industrial Revolution. If you take Karl Marx said, well, that can not go on like this forever. This will collapse and we'll have a totally different political system based on socialism and communism. But in the end, the capitalistic system was able to reorganize itself, rearrange itself, open itself up to offer more rights to individuals. So we could have some holidays in some countries at least, that we could have more decent wages, minimum wages, and things like that. And basically, capitalism was able to survive this transition. Will it be something like that, or will it be that we're going to screw things up completely? And then what we then need to do today is think about, okay, how will we, as human beings, not even as a society anymore, as human beings, how will we prepare for such a catastrophic shock? And which scenario, I will humbly say, I don't know, but I think at this point we need to consider a range of scenarios along that spectrum.
How can we protect all of those things that we have always taken for granted, at least until now? Things like democracy, value of truth, expertise, information, which is real, things like institutions, trust in institutions, law and order, tolerance. How can we protect those things?
Yeah, I think that the two main elements for me are empowerment and education. So one of the problems that we face is there are very strong narratives of, just go on with your life, live your life, and don't come mess with the big boys. You can't do anything about it anyway. There is no alternative, to take the words of Margaret Thatcher. I think this idea there is no alternative, you have no weight on what happens next. Your contribution as a typical person in the world is so minuscule that what does my contribution change? I think that is something that we have to attack. So empowerment means that you tell people that the actions that they take, what they say, how they view the world, that individually this has a infinitesimal, minuscule impact, but taken together, that has a substantial impact. What we value, why do we value money so obscenely and without any meaning anymore? Like, once you're up a couple millions, what do you do with the next ones? And not to talk about billions, except do a little bit of politics when you have billions. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So the perception that we give about what is valuable, what is meaningful, the fact that when we speak, our voice, does not change the world, but the voice has some impact on the world, and our action speaks a lot more than our words. And so I think that telling younger people, our students, but also adults, more established people, that yes, the situation is more than serious, but what we do next, how we engage with the world, how we project values in our daily lives, in our social and political actions, that does make a difference. And those who want to have the most power, they're very happy to tell us, no, you can't make a difference, but we can. When people, say go to court in the United States for the moment to stop the actions of Trump and Musk, they make a difference. It makes it a lot harder for Trump and Musk to push their agenda. Of course, at some point, your society kind of collapses. There's not enough freedom anymore. And at that point, you cannot say anything anymore, because if you say something, you're going to prison. So that limits your degrees of freedom. So right now is the moment where we all have to realize that, yes, I will not change the world, except for a very few of us, but like a handful of us. I will not change the world, but I will help steer the world in a certain direction, in a direction that is more tolerant, more benevolent. And I think that now we are at this very difficult moment where we are seeing the society shrinks. We're seeing people say, well, should I go to that protest? Because if I do, what will be the reactions of others? So we are at maybe this tipping point, or close to a tipping point. It's going to be too late, quite soon. And the situation is is really, I mean, let's be fair. Trump in the United States, Putin in Russia, Xi Jinping in China, Modi in India, Europe. Oh God, it's the Netherlands, Austria. France is looking terrible. So this is not good. And either we say, yeah, we throw our hands in the air and we say we can't do anything, or we mobilize and it can be small actions, because also we imagine that it's only like the top political actions, but political action takes place in a landscape. So what you also do with your neighbors in your community, the fact that we all isolated in front of our screens, which we're perpetuating a little bit here, but I also speak a lot in public, the fact that we are, really building these social networks in real life where we reassure people, because there's a lot of anxiety also when I'm more on the progressive side, but I also understand that people who are more conservative often are really driven by a lot of anxiety. And if anxiety was to go down, then this conservatism would go down as well. And that goes down when we understand each other, when we feel connected to each other. So connecting people, that's another element. And for empowerment, I would say education. Now, of course, you can say, well, you could do something, you can say something, but if people don't know how to look at the world, and basically all they consume are Twitter feeds or Instagram feeds, that they will just, the only thing they can reproduce in terms of thought, in terms of narratives and discourse, is whatever they've heard. And so education is also an important part. I don't say that if you fix education, everything is fixed. That would be too simple. But I would say that education is a kind of prerequisite. We have to transform the way we educate people to help them in their empowerment. And I think I don't know how to really organize this, but at least we have a good example of this empowerment education structure. And I would say this is around feminism, where people over many years have built intellectual tools to create discourse, to create narratives, to change society. And I'm a cisgender 50-something white male, so I get irritated once in a while. But at the same time, I see that this desire for change has really deep justification. And I might not always agree on the manner, but I certainly agree on the objective of working towards fairer society, in particular for women. And then when you are there, you can extend it to different groups, like gender-related groups, like racialized and ethnic groups. So we can build things from there. If you're a feminist, I'm not particularly a feminist, but I think that this idea of creating the intellectual tools, giving them to people, giving them a voice that they can use to push back and participate to change, I think the general strategy is something that we should achieve in this area as well, saying we need to think again about the relationship between society and technology and the economy, and that technology cannot just be a way to create a new market and make millions. I mean, this is not what technology is for. Technology is there to improve the lives of people. At least that's my view on technology. That we should really think about, okay, what technologies will help people. When we create social media where we design it to get people hooked to their smartphones and spend as much time as we can by providing them emotional content, in particularly divisive content, we're criminals. I mean, this is toxic to society. Why would someone in their right mind do something like that? But that's a reality today. So maybe if people said, well, I don't want to be doing this. So in particular, when you have a tech background, I always say you have a superpower, and your superpower is that you can stand up from your chair in front of your computer, you can walk through the door, and you can find another job. That is a luxury that many people don't have, and that many people, I'm not saying everyone in technology has. And we should use that. We should say, no, I'm thinking about what you want me to contribute to, and I don't want that. I want to be doing something else with my life. And I think younger people are with a different mindset. So a fair chunk of the younger generation is really already thinking a lot more with that mindset, saying, okay, well, what am I going to contribute to? And do I think it makes sense? And I think that's really, really important. And I think we should build on that. And therefore, we should give younger people the tools to reflect about technology, to make what I call intentional choices. So I'm not choosing because this is what's going to bring somebody else more money. I'm choosing because I think that this makes sense. And what makes sense for you and what makes sense for me is different. So there's also a lot of freedom potentially there. Rather, I'm I'm not telling you what you should think. I'm trying to influence people by telling them to think about something. That's already a lot, actually. It's a lot of influence. But then in the end, I'm happy when people say, well, actually, the way I see things is different. I don't have the same view as you, but I thought about it. And because I thought about it, I'm making these choices. And anyway, you'll be more careful in your choices. It's when you stop thinking, when you just regurgitate whatever you've heard because it sounded cool or it was said by somebody you find cool, and this is all you're processing, then I think you have a problem. So I think that I'm making this gambit, this bet, that if we have more people think about what they do in terms of technology, that on balance, this would be favorable to a better world. It's a bit of a gambit. I mean, I don't know for sure, but that's just what I want to believe.
So if you are going to give a message to the next generation in terms of how to live their lives, how to think, what's the right way to maintain their agency. Uh, I've seen that you've given a number of speeches to some people who graduated. What's your main message to them?
Yeah, my main message is that they have agency if they wish to, so they have to take it because somebody else will be happy to take it from them. That I mean, the times ahead are not looking great. Let's just not just be overly optimistic about technology. We're in a bad spot. Um, so if we change the way we look at technology through education, for example, we can have a generation, including I'll put myself in there because I've gone through this 10, 15 years of personal path that has led me to a very different place that I was 15 years ago. So everybody can do it. You don't have to be a 20. That we can really reorganize ourselves and put priorities. Would that solve all the problems we're facing? Maybe not, but it will certainly have an impact. It will make things less bad than they could be. Or in the worst case, if things really go down the drain and, you know, 50, 70 years from now, we're in a catastrophic situation, at least we'll have people to build a world that would come after that. This is not my preferred path because I see a lot of suffering there. You can hear that discourse quite a bit of people saying, "Yeah, well, it's just all going to be a catastrophe. It'll go all down the drain, and after that we can build something better." Well, that's not something you wish because we are like 8 billion going to 10 billion. This is massive suffering that we'd have to face. So we don't want to be there. But we're not necessarily the ones pushing to go there. So if we happen to go there, well, at least if we have the people to have a different view of the world. And their education for me is really important. Engineering, this is changing slowly, but still in many places, including my own university, we're not always that good with that. We have a view of engineers as people who are just there to solve problems and not ask too many questions. And I think this is really problematic, that you are supposed to be excellent at your technical skills, and you're not supposed to pass judgment and to question what is it, why you're doing it. And I think this is very wrong. And I think this comes from our historical background. So as engineers and scientists, we like to think of ourselves as geeks, kind of disconnected from the world. And I think this is a totally wrong vision. Engineering is a central component of society. You just turn your head around and everything you touch is the product of deep engineering. I'm looking at a IKEA cupboard in front of me, which is designed to make the best of resources. It's actually not the worst product. It's a very intelligent use of resources. There might be problems in how these resources are obtained, but it's still a very intelligent use of resources. A computer, a smartphone, all of a piece of glass, all of this is the product of decades or centuries of technological progress. They are marvels of technology. And so saying, oh, I'm just an engineer, I'm just a geek who's behind his computer or likes to do some math, that is totally wrong. But it's a story we like to tell ourselves because it's a story where we don't have a lot of responsibility. It's not putting a lot of weight on our shoulders. But if you go back in history, if you take Belgium, in Belgium, engineers carry the title civil engineer even if they don't build buildings. In French, you say ingénieur civil. And civil means a civilian by opposition to military, because at some point in the past, it was important to make the distinction between the military engineers who would build a fortress and a civil engineer would build a road. And then those who build the roads happen to also move into electricity and then electronics and all kinds of engineering. So this history going back to an engineer is somebody who built stuff for the army, which was a central role of engineers, at the end of the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance. That is still part of our DNA, and we'd like to hide that. We'd like to think that, yeah, we're just those geeks. But we are actually people who maybe not make a lot of choices, but affect a lot of impact on society. Our designs, when you design Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, you are having an impact on society. And I don't want to let you get away with the idea of saying, well, I'm just programming a module to do a prediction of ads, or I'm building a large database, and what am I doing? I don't have any responsibility. I want to pin people to their responsibility. You're not responsible for everything that happens in a technology you contribute to. In my case, I work on genetics, and yes, I work on it to contribute to medical genetics and help, for example, diagnose people better, which I think is intrinsically good. But I also see how it can be misused as a form of surveillance. Do I have responsibility on that part? Well, probably less than on the fact that I'm working on medical. But should I just close my eyes and say, it's other people, somebody else should deal with the problem? So I want to pin people to their responsibility. I want people to be morally engaged so that they have to basically follow the consequences of what they are doing and accept those and then make choices for themselves. And so if we have that kind of system, if we change radically our culture around technology, I think that even if it's just 10, 20%, and I think the younger generation is already moving in that direction, we can have a tremendous impact. For example, companies like Philip Morris have a hard time recruiting people to work in their labs. They have big labs, but they have to look for people. It's clearly a bottleneck. It clearly slows them down. And so I think that the same thing should happen more generally. People should reflect. When I was a grad student, it was super cool to work for the financial sector. Today, well, there's still a lot of people working in the financial sector, but it's not a typical dream, or a lot less so, for an engineer to become somebody on Wall Street. Still happens. Still happens with people that I'm close to, in fact, but the perspective is different. And saying that this being more critical. Also, when you reach this kind of it's not exactly critical mass, but think about 5, 10, 15, 20% of people inside an institution. That can be a company, that can be part of the government, can be a university. Then the social dynamics also changes. The decision making also changes. And so there, basically, we can also hope that we don't have to change everyone to see major impact. I think that just having a chunk of people who have a different way, then there is always this middle ground of people who are just happy to kind of follow whatever is the dominant narrative at the time, and then you can take them with you. So I think that is how I view change over a period of a few decades. And I think this is achievable. I think that is a demand. When I teach students about ethics, you can feel that, oh, this is stuff that I'm happy to know. I mean, when it's the differential equation, it's like, oh, yes, I have to struggle with this. But when I talk about ethics, because I teach a small module about ethics, I can sense that the students are really thinking, yeah, that I wanted to know. It kind of helps. And just by knowing all these stories, there are lots of wonderful stories we could tell our students. For example, the idea that scientists only have to be objective and they have to, be away from politics. I'll go back to after World War II, or just the end of World War II. Well, the development of the atom bomb was a political choice by scientists. And maybe in the end you could say, should we really have done that? But it was clearly the result of a reflection about the risks and benefits with limited information. They pushed for that. Many of the same people who pushed for the development of the bomb, they, after the war, were socially extremely engaged. You take Bertrand Russell, you take Albert Einstein, you take Linus Pauling, he was not involved in the bomb. You take Otto Hahn, he was on the German side. Those people were really important voices to avoid nuclear proliferation after World War II. So it's not true that scientists have always been disconnected from society. That is a narrative that is favorable to those who want to use technology to run businesses, which I think is fine, to make money, which I think is acceptable to a certain degree, to make more and more and more money, which I don't think is really that acceptable. When you see that your deployment of wealth is really contributing to hurting the world, you should be able to perceive that. Of course, you can tell yourself stories that what you're doing is wonderful and the world that will come after will be wonderful. That is a problem. But you should be able to reflect enough to realize, okay, here we are at a level where, I mean, take Meta and Instagram, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg knew that the information that was pushed to teenagers was toxic to young women in terms of anorexia, for example, and it just doesn't seem to care. And I think there at that point you could say, yeah, what's wrong with you? I mean, you should be able to, and of course there's been congressional hearings and that doesn't change everything. Obviously, it still doesn't seem to care. But yeah, that's the kind of changes that we want to make go through. They're not happening right now, but that doesn't mean that they cannot happen sometime in the future.
Before we conclude, I wanted to ask you, we are both Europeans. What's a hopeful view for Europe, the Europe of the future?
Yeah. So, I mean, on the one hand, Europe is still an incredible opportunity. But we have to be sober. First of all, we have to realize that the political landscape in Europe is bad. Okay, well, yes, the Conservatives were defeated in the UK. I still count UK as part of Europe if it's not part of the European Union. Yeah, exactly. But the Reform Party with Nigel Farage seems to be doing very, very well now. Yeah, many countries already in Europe are really with a very right slant. The worst case is Hungary by far. And then you have Poland. Then you have problems in Austria, in the Netherlands. So claiming that Europe is this beacon of humanistic vision for the world, I think we need to be a bit modest on that one. But still, that worldview, I think, is immensely valuable. And so if the people of Europe can organize themselves to avoid falling in the same trap as we're seeing elsewhere, then Europe could really be this idea for the rest of the world whenever they are ready to move to something different. Now, let's be a little bit critical. I mean, yes, there are important ideas, there is important worldview, very humanistic worldview that gets projected. Does it get translated into reality? That's not always very clear. The way that we are treating migrants crossing the Mediterranean is a crime. We're not doing anything about what's happening in Gaza today. So we shouldn't lecture people too much about human rights. We should be appropriately modest. But at the same time, this is really something that many Europeans, it's part of our culture, it's part of our way of life. This balance also, like, do you have to work every minute of the day, or your family, your friends, your other contributions to society, is that important? That is still embedded very much in the European way of life, and that is really important. This is a fundamental contribution to humanity in a certain sense, really. And so we should be, appropriately modest, but also appropriately proud of that. We should certainly not get bullied, because you will see that very strongly today. Yeah, we are lagging behind. We don't have any company on the size of Microsoft, Facebook, Google. Yeah, that's true. That's bad. That's a failure. But should we just be ashamed and because of that decide to throw away every single type of regulation that we have, like the GDPR, like the AI Act? I think that there is voices from outside of Europe and also inside of Europe that say, no, let's just drop all this bullshit and just let's move forward with a model like the American model, hyper competitive, hyper individualistic, and the people should dare say no. We should be able to look at people saying that and saying, are you stupid? I mean, and do it maybe more politely than using the word stupid, but are you silly? I mean, is it really, do you really want people to go to bed worried about what's going to happen next, what will be the job a month, 3 months from now, and wake up with the same worries? Is that the life that we want in a society that can produce so much already? Is that what you want? Or do you want a society where people have time to spend with their family, to see their friends when they have a weekend, to be connected, to not feel isolated? And isolation, I think, is an important point where maybe we've missed something important. So in the more conservative trend we see, we imagine that everybody there is some rich, nasty guy who just wants power from themselves. But when we look at who votes, what they will vote for, we realize that, well, there are people who are in a favorable position in society, but there's a lot of people who are actually in quite bad position in society. And I think that people like myself, or who deem themselves more progressive, we're not able to connect anymore to this large portion of the population that feels excluded, that says, yeah, it's nice, your way of looking at the world when you have an academic degree and a job where during a pandemic you can stay home and you know that you will have a pension, and I have none of that. And so I think that people who are progressive should also think how we're going to reconnect with that part of the population who currently listens to populistic voices, and that maybe we should have a way to connect with them and not feel them even more excluded. Sometimes in the way we approach the problem, very sophisticated, where you need to know the right words, the right way of speaking. I mean, woke language, if you want. We are excluding people even if we don't want to. And left parties across Europe, often people who are poor say, well, what is this left party doing for me? It's not doing anything for me. So I just, let's just vote right wing, hoping that they will throw things on the ground and maybe something better will come out. But right now I'm suffering. And so I think that these are really elements that we have to connect to each other and really project a new view of the future without sounding like a silly utopian, but thinking, no, we can do a lot better than that. And if we can be convincing that message, then I think that there's a way to bring society in another direction. Can this happen before we go through a terrible phase? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I'm not super optimistic, but I want to be optimistic. And so let's just fight for this because it's worth fighting. There is a better world with all the technology that we have than the world we live in today and the world we expect tomorrow.
Thanks very much for that, Professor Yves Moreau. Um, we need to become intentional about technology. What is the good of life? Let's do intentional choices. And as Europeans, we have to be sober, but yet remember that we can be a beacon for the rest of the world. So thank you so much.
Very much for the invitation. I really appreciate the time here that you were willing to take. Thanks a lot, Manny.
It's not a time I'm willing to. It's a time that I need for my own inspiration. I also aspire to become an intellectual like you.
But you're doing amazing work around genetic diversity of population. I've been following your trips even to Iquitos in Peru, and I think this is a way concretely where we as scientists connect with the real world. We go into the world. We're not just behind our computer all the time. And I think this is the kind of concrete contribution that does not change the world at once, but gives a positive signal to everybody around you. So thanks for that.
I'm sure that we'll work together. I'm absolutely convinced. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.